Welcome to Northern Mystery Archives. Here we don't soften the truth and we don't skip the details. We investigate the forgotten files from the far north of Canada, the disappearances that were quietly shelved, the settlements that faded from every map, the transmissions that were never meant to be heard again. In this channel, nothing is hidden. Every fragment, every silence, every erased trail is examined with the seriousness these cases deserved but never received. If you value cold, atmospheric, minimalist investigations into the unexplained wilderness of the North, you're in the right place. Subscribe, stay close, and step with us into the files they hoped no one would ever revisit. Below, we will be speaking about the case titled exactly Hazel Rennick, January 2, 1982, Shadows over Isolated Cabin Report. It all began when a radio operator at a forestry station 300 kilometers north of Thunder Bay received a transmission that wasn't supposed to exist. The signal came through at 0417 on the morning of January 2, 1982. The operator's log recorded it as a voice transmission lasting exactly 41 seconds before terminating without warning. The voice belonged to someone identifying herself as Hazel Rennick, a woman who, according to provincial records, had not contacted any authorities in over 14 months. A last confirmed sighting placed her at a supply post near Wabakimi Provincial Park during the first week of November 1980. She had purchased provisions for an extended winter stay. Canned goods, lamp oil, 200 rounds of rifle ammunition, medical supplies, and 3 topographical maps covering the region between Smooth Rock Lake and the Albany River watershed. The transaction was recorded in the post ledger with her signature. After that, she vanished into the boreal forest without filing a route plan or notifying anyone of her destination. The transmission received on January 2nd was fragmented. The audio quality suggested extreme distance or atmospheric interference. The operator noted unusual background sounds, a low mechanical hum that didn't match any known equipment patterns, and what might have been wind, though the cadence was irregular, almost rhythmic. Hazel Rennick's voice on the tape was calm. She spoke slowly, enunciating each word as though she anticipated the message might not be received clearly. She mentioned coordinates. She mentioned something she called the watching structure. And then the transmission cut to static. The forestry station forwarded the recording to regional authorities, who classified it as a possible distress call and initiated a standard wilderness recovery protocol. But the coordinates Hazel provided placed her location inside an area marked on survey maps as inaccessible terrain. No trails, no logging roads, no established camps. Just unbroken forest, stretching for 70 kilometers in every direction. 3 weeks after the transmission, a team was assembled. They reached the coordinates after 5 days of snowshoe travel through conditions that claimed 2 of their sleds and left 1 team member with severe frostbite. What they found became the subject of a file that was transferred between 7 different departments before being archived with a classification status that discouraged further inquiry. The cabin existed, but according to the provincial database, no structure had ever been registered or permitted at that location. It appeared on no historical survey. No forestry assessments referenced it. The building materials suggested construction dating back at least 40 years, yet there was no record of any settlement activity in that grid section during the relevant period. Inside the cabin, investigators documented signs of recent habitation. A cast-iron stove still held warm ash. Canned food sat opened on a rough-hewn table. Blankets lay folded on a wooden cot. And nailed to the wall above the entrance, a handwritten note in blue ink stated simply, "Gone to the second site. Do not follow after dark." Hazel Rennick was not found. The team conducted a search radius extending 12 kilometers from the cabin over 4 days before deteriorating weather-forced evacuation. No tracks led away from the structure. No signs of disturbance indicated struggle or injury. The cabin sat in a small clearing surrounded by dense spruce and pine, silent and undisturbed beneath the weight of fresh snow. The case file was closed 6 months later with a notation of presumed wilderness fatality due to exposure or misadventure. But the recording remained, and the cabin remained, and somewhere in the northern Ontario forest, the coordinates still mark a location where something waits that was never adequately explained. This is the file on Hazel Rennick. Wabakimi Provincial Park occupies nearly 900,000 hectares of wilderness in northwestern Ontario. The region is characterized by boreal forest, glacially carved waterways, exposed granite shield geology, and seasonal temperature extremes that can drop below -40 degrees Celsius during winter months. Human presence is minimal. Park infrastructure consists of a handful of unmanned ranger stations and seasonal canoe routes used primarily during summer months. The area where Hazel Rennick was believed to have traveled lies beyond even these minimal boundaries, in what forestry maps designate as Zone 7, an unmanaged wilderness buffer separating provincial parkland from Crown Forest territory extending north toward James Bay. There are no maintained trails, no cabins appear in official records. The region is accessible only by float plane, winter snowmobile traverse, or multi-day foot travel during frozen months when waterways become navigable ice highways. Hazel Rennick had arrived in the Thunder Bay area during the spring of 1979. She had rented a small efficiency apartment above a hardware store on Cumberland Street and found work as a cataloguer at the public library. She lived quietly, kept to herself, and according to her landlord, paid rent on time and never caused trouble. Her background was sparse. She listed a previous address in Winnipeg on her rental application, but the property manager who ran a reference check found the building had been demolished 2 years earlier. Her employment history showed gaps. She had worked seasonally, primarily in roles that required minimal documentation: fire tower observer, trail maintenance, inventory clerk at remote supply depots. People who interacted with her during her time in Thunder Bay described her as polite but distant. She attended no community events. She formed no close relationships. At the library, she worked primarily in the archives section, handling historical documents and old survey records that few patrons requested. One colleague recalled that Hazel seemed particularly interested in maps, topographical surveys, old logging company records, anything documenting the territory north of the city. In October of 1980, Hazel gave notice at the library. She told her supervisor she was planning an extended wilderness trip and wouldn't be returning for several months. She emptied her apartment, paid final rent, and left no forwarding information. Her last known movements placed her at the supply post near Caribou Lake, purchasing winter provisions. The post operator remembered her because of the quantity of supplies she acquired: enough food for 4 months, heavy cold weather gear, a detailed inquiry about ice conditions on the northern waterways. She asked about unmapped areas, places where old logging camps used to operate before the companies pulled out in the 50s. The operator told her that most of those sites had been reclaimed by forest, that nothing remained except rotted foundations and overgrown trails that went nowhere. Hazel thanked him. She loaded her supplies into a canoe and paddled north up the chain of lakes that eventually feed into the Albany River system. The operator watched her disappear into the morning mist. That was the last confirmed visual sighting. The region she entered is a landscape defined by silence. The forest is old growth, dense stands of black spruce and jack pine, interspersed with birch and trembling aspen. The ground is uneven, broken by granite outcrops and shallow muskeg wetlands that freeze solid in winter. Lakes are numerous, connected by narrow channels and beaver-dammed streams. In summer, the area is nearly impassable due to swarms of black flies and mosquitoes. In winter, it becomes a monochrome expanse where the boundary between sky and snow-covered ice dissolves into uniform grey. There are no towns, no roads. The nearest human settlement is a seasonal fishing camp 80 kilometers south. Even the indigenous traplines that once crossed the region have been largely abandoned since the decline of the fur trade. The area is empty in a way that most of southern Canada has forgotten. It is a place where you can travel for days without encountering any sign that humans have ever existed. And yet traces remain. Old trapping cabins slowly collapsing into the earth. Forgotten survey markers rusted beyond legibility, trails that lead to nowhere and stop abruptly as though whoever made them simply vanished mid-step. This was the landscape Hazel Rennick chose. This was the territory she entered with 4 months of supplies and no stated destination. When her radio transmission arrived 14 months later, it came from a location that should have been impossible to reach without proper equipment and support. But Hazel had reached it. The radio transmission was analyzed by communications specialists at the Ministry of Natural Resources Regional Office in Thunder Bay. The tape was duplicated and enhanced to isolate Hazel's voice from the interference patterns. The final cleaned recording lasted 38 seconds and contained a total of 93 words. The transcript reads as follows: "This is Hazel Rennick. If anyone receives this transmission, record the following coordinates: 51 degrees, 14 minutes north, 89 degrees, 42 minutes west. I've been at the cabin site for 8 months. Supplies are adequate. I am not injured. There is a structure approximately 3 kilometers northeast of my location. I observed lights on 3 separate occasions. The structure is not on any map I have. It appears to be monitoring something. I attempted approach twice but could not reach it. I will attempt a third approach tomorrow at dawn. If I do not return, someone should investigate. The watching structure should be documented, that's all." The coordinates placed her in a section of forest approximately 40 kilometers north of the nearest named lake. The area was designated as unlogged wilderness, with no recorded human activity since a brief mineral survey conducted in 1953. The survey had found nothing of commercial value, and the area was never revisited. When the transcript was reviewed by search and rescue coordinators, several details stood out immediately. Hazel stated she had been at a cabin site for 8 months, which meant she had established a base camp shortly after her disappearance and had survived an entire winter in complete isolation. She mentioned supplies being adequate, which suggested she had either cached additional provisions or was supplementing her food through hunting and trapping. And most significantly, she referenced a structure that didn't appear on any official map. The decision to initiate a recovery operation was not immediate. The coordinates were remote. The season was midwinter. Hazel had stated she was not injured and had adequate supplies, which meant there was no immediate threat to life requiring urgent response. Some officials suggested waiting until spring when access would be easier. Others argued that the reference to an unmapped structure warranted investigation regardless of season. A compromise was reached. A small team would be assembled consisting of 2 provincial conservation officers, a wilderness guide with experience in the region, and a medical technician. They would travel by snowmobile to the nearest accessible point and then proceed on foot to the coordinates. The expected duration was 7 days round trip, weather permitting. The team departed on January 23rd, 3 weeks after Hazel's transmission. Conditions were stable initially: clear skies, temperatures holding at -25 Celsius, good visibility. They made strong progress for the first 2 days, covering 60 kilometers on packed snow trails that paralleled frozen waterways. On the 3rd day, they left the trail network and entered unbroken forest. Navigation became difficult. The terrain was irregular, forcing constant detours around windfall and dense undergrowth. The snowmobile sleds struggled with the uneven ground. One sled broke through thin ice covering a concealed stream and had to be abandoned. The guide's GPS unit malfunctioned, possibly due to cold, forcing reliance on compass and topographical maps. Progress slowed to less than 10 kilometers per day. They reached the coordinates on day 5. The cabin sat in a clearing, roughly 40 meters in diameter, surrounded by tall spruce trees that blocked wind and created an enclosed, almost cathedral-like space. The structure was small, perhaps 4 meters by 5 meters, constructed from hand-hewn logs with a peaked roof covered in tarps weighed down by stones. A metal chimney pipe extended from the roof, but no smoke rose from it. The team approached cautiously. There were no fresh tracks in the snow around the cabin. No signs of recent activity. The door was closed but not locked. One of the conservation officers knocked and called out, identifying himself as provincial police. No response came. He pushed the door open. The interior was dim, lit only by daylight filtering through a single small window. The cast-iron stove in the corner still contained ash, and when one of the team members touched it, he reported residual warmth, though not enough to indicate recent use. The cabin was orderly. Canned goods lined shelves made from planks laid across log supports. A cot held folded blankets. A kerosene lamp sat on the table. A small bookshelf contained field guides, a journal, and several maps. Hazel's journal was removed and later became part of the investigation file. It contained daily entries dating back to March of 1981, roughly 2 months after her last confirmed sighting at the supply post. The entries documented her travel north, the discovery of the cabin site, and her work repairing the structure and establishing a sustainable winter routine. Her writing was methodical, noting weather patterns, wildlife observations, and resource management. But the final entries changed in tone. Beginning in late November, Hazel began writing about lights. She described seeing illumination in the forest to the northeast, visible only at night and only under certain conditions. She documented 3 separate sightings. The lights were white, steady, and appeared to originate from a fixed location. She estimated the distance at approximately 3 kilometers based on the intensity and angle of observation. Hazel wrote that she attempted to reach the light source on 2 occasions. Both attempts ended when she lost sight of the lights and became disoriented in the darkness. She returned to the cabin each time. The final journal entry was dated December 30th. It stated, "Tomorrow I will reach the structure. I have planned a daylight approach and will use marked trees to maintain a return route. Whatever is out there has been watching this area for some time. It should be documented." The team found the note nailed to the wall above the door. "Gone to the second site. Do not follow after dark." The message was written in the same handwriting as the journal. No date was provided. The note suggested Hazel had established a second location, but no indication of its coordinates or direction appeared anywhere in her belongings. The search radius was established at 12 kilometers, based on the distance an individual could reasonably travel and return in a single day. The team spent 4 days combing the forest to the northeast, following the direction Hazel indicated in her journal. They found nothing, no structure, no signs of artificial light sources, no tracks. The forest was undisturbed, silent, and gave no indication that anyone had passed through recently. On the 4th day, weather deteriorated. A winter storm moved in from the northwest, bringing heavy snow and dropping temperatures to -38°C. Visibility fell to less than 20 meters. The team made the decision to evacuate. They returned to the cabin, collected Hazel's journal and personal effects as evidence, and began the return journey. They experienced equipment failures during the retreat. The remaining snowmobile sled developed mechanical problems. Radio communication became intermittent. One team member suffered frostbite on both hands and required evacuation by emergency air transport once they reached an accessible location. The operation concluded on February 6th, 14 days after departure. Hazel Rennick was not recovered. The cabin coordinates were marked in the file. The journal was archived. The provincial police opened a formal missing persons case on February 10th, designating Hazel Rennick as a wilderness disappearance subject with unknown status. The file was assigned to Detective Owen Cartwright, a veteran investigator with experience in remote area cases. His initial review focused on establishing Hazel's background and identifying any circumstances that might explain her extended isolation and subsequent disappearance. Cartwright requested records from Winnipeg authorities based on Hazel's stated previous residence. The response revealed no one named Hazel Rennick had ever held a lease or employment in the city during the time period she claimed. The address she provided didn't match any existing or demolished buildings. Birth records and social insurance databases returned no matches. Hazel Rennick, as far as official documentation could determine, did not exist prior to her arrival in Thunder Bay in 1979. This discovery prompted a deeper examination of her activities in Thunder Bay. Cartwright interviewed Hazel's former landlord, library colleagues, and the operator at the supply post. Each described her as competent and self-sufficient, but offered little insight into her personal history or motivations. She had arrived with cash, paid for everything in cash, and left no financial trail beyond her rental payments and employment income. The library supervisor provided one useful detail. Hazel had requested access to archival materials related to forestry operations in the Wabakimi region during the 1940s and 50s. She had spent considerable time reviewing old logging company records, particularly documents related to camps that had operated briefly and then closed without explanation. The supervisor didn't know why Hazel was interested in these records, but remembered she had taken extensive notes. Cartwright obtained copies of the logging records Hazel had examined. The documents detailed operations by Northern Timber Consolidated, a company that had established several remote camps in the region between 1947 and 1954. Most camps operated normally, harvesting pine and spruce for pulp mills in southern Ontario, but one camp, designated Station 7, appeared in the records only briefly before all references ceased. The final notation, dated September 1953, stated, "Operations suspended pending resolution of equipment anomalies and personnel concerns. Site abandoned in place. The coordinates for Station 7 were listed in the documents." When Cartwright compared them to the location of Hazel's cabin, he found they were separated by approximately 14 kilometers. Not an exact match, but within the same general region. He requested aerial surveys of the area, hoping to identify any remnants of the old logging camp that might explain Hazel's interest. The aerial photographs revealed nothing but unbroken forest. If Station 7 had existed, it had been completely reclaimed by the wilderness. No clearings, no road traces, no structural remnants were visible. Cartwright noted this in his report and moved on to other aspects of the investigation. The journal provided the most detailed insight into Hazel's mental state and activities during her isolation. Her entries from March through October documented a methodical routine. She repaired the cabin, established food caches, hunted small game, and maintained detailed observations of weather and wildlife patterns. Her writing was clear and organized, showing no signs of psychological distress or irrational thinking. The shift occurred in November with the first mention of lights. Hazel described the phenomenon carefully, noting date, time, weather conditions, and duration of each sighting. She hypothesized several explanations. Northern lights, though the color and behavior didn't match aurora patterns. Aircraft, though no flight paths crossed the region and the lights didn't move. Reflection from distant ice formations, though the consistency argued against natural phenomena. She concluded that the lights originated from an artificial source, something constructed, something operating with regularity. She used the term watching structure in her December entries, explaining that the lights appeared to sweep in a pattern as though surveying the surrounding forest. This detail troubled investigators. It suggested Hazel believed the lights were intentionally monitoring the area, which implied either paranoia or the presence of something genuinely anomalous. Cartwright consulted with Ministry of Natural Resources officials about possible explanations. Could there be an unmapped research station in the region, a weather monitoring facility, a military installation? The responses were uniform. No government operations existed in that area, no permits had been issued for any construction, no agencies had any activity logged in that grid section. Cartwright then investigated whether private interests might have established something without proper authorization. Illegal mining operations perhaps, or a rogue logging outfit. But such operations would leave obvious traces. Equipment, access roads, cleared areas. The aerial surveys showed none of these indicators. The final aspect of the investigation involved the note Hazel left. Gone to the second site. Do not follow after dark. Cartwright found this message particularly unsettling. It suggested Hazel had identified a second location beyond the structure she mentioned in her journal, and the warning implied danger associated with approaching it after dark. A follow-up search operation was proposed for spring once weather conditions improved. The plan called for a larger team, extended duration, and expanded search radius. But before the operation could be organized, Cartwright received information that altered the direction of the investigation. A retired forestry supervisor contacted provincial police in March, claiming he had information relevant to the Hazel Rennick case. The supervisor, whose name was removed from the public file, stated that he had worked for Northern Timber Consolidated during the early 1950s. He had visited Station 7 once, shortly before operations were suspended. He remembered the camp because of the circumstances surrounding its closure. According to the supervisor, workers at Station 7 reported hearing mechanical sounds in the forest at night. A steady, low-frequency hum that didn't correspond to any equipment they operated. Some workers also reported seeing lights moving through the trees after dark. The company investigated, suspecting equipment malfunction or unauthorized personnel, but found nothing to explain the phenomena. The situation escalated when several workers refused to remain at the camp overnight. They claimed to feel watched. They described an oppressive sense of presence in the forest that intensified after sunset. The company brought in a foreman from another camp to assess the situation. The foreman spent 2 nights at Station 7 and recommended immediate closure. His report, which the supervisor remembered but could not produce, stated that whatever was in that forest was not something the company should disturb further. Station 7 was abandoned. Equipment was left in place. Workers were reassigned. The coordinates were removed from company maps. And according to the supervisor, there had been an informal understanding among company management that the region was to be avoided. No logging operations ever returned to that area. Cartwright documented this information but could not verify it. Northern Timber Consolidated had dissolved in the 1960s. Company records were incomplete or lost. The supervisor's account was the only source, and without corroborating evidence, it remained anecdotal. Still, the parallels to Hazel's observations were striking enough to be included in the case file. The spring search operation never occurred. Funding was not allocated. The case was reclassified as a cold file in May of 1982. Hazel Rennick's journal and personal effects were placed in evidence storage. The cabin coordinates remained on record, marked with a notation advising caution for any personnel entering the area. Several theories have been proposed to explain Hazel Rennick's disappearance and the circumstances surrounding her final months in the wilderness. None have been confirmed. Each raises as many questions as it answers. What follows is an examination of the primary explanations considered by investigators and wilderness experts familiar with the case. The first theory is the simplest. Hazel became disoriented during her attempt to reach the structure she observed, suffered an injury or exposure, and succumbed to the elements. Her remains were never found because the wilderness is vast and conceals evidence efficiently. This explanation accounts for the physical disappearance, but doesn't address the lights she documented or the existence of the cabin she inhabited, which appeared on no official records. The second theory suggests Hazel experienced a psychological break brought on by extended isolation. The lights were hallucinations. The watching structure was a delusion. Her increasingly focused documentation of these phenomena reflected a deteriorating mental state rather than objective observation. The note warning against following after dark was a manifestation of paranoia. Under this interpretation, Hazel wandered into the forest in pursuit of something that existed only in her mind and never returned. This theory has support from psychological research on isolation effects. Prolonged solitude in extreme environments can produce sensory distortions, auditory and visual hallucinations, and delusional thinking. Hazel spent over a year alone in a harsh wilderness setting with minimal external stimulation. However, her journal entries remained coherent and methodical even in the final weeks. She demonstrated no other symptoms typically associated with severe psychological distress. Her observations were detailed and consistent, which argues against hallucination. The third theory involves the abandoned logging camp. According to this interpretation, Hazel discovered remnants of Station 7 during her travels and became interested in the site's history. The structure she referenced might have been an old piece of equipment or a collapsed building that, under certain light conditions, appeared unusual. The lights could have been reflections from metal surfaces or ice formations catching moonlight or starlight. Her death occurred during exploration of the old campsite, possibly due to falling through unstable flooring or encountering other hazards associated with decayed structures. This explanation aligns with Hazel's documented interest in historical logging operations and provides a rational framework for her observations. But it requires the existence of physical remnants from Station 7, which aerial surveys failed to detect. Additionally, the supervisor's account suggests the camp was deliberately left intact when abandoned, meaning there should have been substantial structural evidence remaining, yet search teams found nothing. The fourth theory is more speculative. It proposes that an undisclosed government or research facility exists in the region, operating without public knowledge. The lights Hazel observed came from this installation. The watching structure was a monitoring station or sensor array. Hazel's disappearance was not accidental, but resulted from her approaching restricted territory. Under this interpretation, authorities know what happened to Hazel, but cannot disclose the information due to security concerns. Evidence for this theory is circumstantial at best. No documentation supports the existence of any classified facility in that location. Freedom of information requests have returned no relevant records. The theory relies on assumptions about government secrecy that cannot be verified. However, it would explain the abrupt closure of the case, the reluctance to conduct follow-up searches, and the absence of physical evidence despite extensive investigation. The fifth theory involves natural phenomena misinterpreted due to limited scientific understanding. The lights could have been a rare atmospheric effect, possibly related to geomagnetic activity or unusual reflections caused by ice crystals in the air. The structure might have been a geological formation that, from a distance and under specific conditions, appeared artificial. Hazel's disappearance was unrelated to the lights and occurred due to conventional wilderness hazards. This theory attempts to rationalize the anomalous elements while acknowledging that not all natural phenomena are well documented or easily explained. Finally, there is the theory that cannot be categorized. It suggests that Hazel encountered something in the wilderness that exists outside conventional understanding, an unknown presence, an entity or phenomenon that operates in remote regions and avoids detection. The watching structure was real, but not human in origin. The lights were surveillance mechanisms belonging to something that prefers isolation and responds negatively to intrusion. Hazel's final approach triggered a response that removed her from the area entirely, leaving no trace. This theory has no supporting evidence and conflicts with scientific understanding of the natural world. It is mentioned here only because it persists in discussions of the case among those familiar with the file. There are remote regions of northern Canada where strange events are reported by trappers, pilots, and wilderness travelers. Lights that move with purpose, sounds that have no identifiable source, structures glimpsed briefly and never relocated. Most such reports are dismissed as misidentification or folklore, but they accumulate over decades, forming a pattern of the unexplained that resists easy categorization. What remains certain is that Hazel Rennick entered the wilderness with clear purpose and vanished under circumstances that defy conventional explanation. The cabin existed where no cabin should have been. The journal documented observations that no search team could verify. The file on Hazel Rennick remains open in the provincial police database. It is classified as a cold case with inactive status. No new leads have emerged in over 4 decades. The cabin at the coordinates she provided has likely collapsed or been reclaimed by forest. The journal sits in an evidence storage facility, its pages yellowed and fragile, and the watching structure, if it ever existed, has never been documented by any subsequent expedition. Attempts to locate relatives or confirm Hazel's identity prior to her arrival in Thunder Bay have been unsuccessful. No one has come forward claiming to know her. No missing persons reports from other jurisdictions match her description. She remains an unnamed presence in official records, a woman who appeared briefly in the historical record and then disappeared into the northern wilderness, leaving behind only fragments of a story that refuses completion. The region where Hazel spent her final months remains as remote today as it was in 1982. Few people travel there. The area is not on recreational hiking routes. It offers no resources of commercial value. It sits in that vast emptiness between named places, a blank space on the map where human activity is minimal and nature operates according to its own rhythms, indifferent to questions and unconcerned with providing answers. There have been no verified reports of lights or structures in the area since Hazel's disappearance. Search and rescue operations conducted for other purposes have passed through the general region without noting anything unusual. If something was there in 1982, it has either ceased operation or has learned to avoid detection more effectively. The forest has returned to silence. Detective Cartwright retired in 1997. Before leaving the force, he recommended that the Hazel Rennick file be periodically reviewed in case new information surfaces or technological advances permit re-examination of evidence. His final notation in the case file reads, "Subject demonstrated high level of wilderness competence and rational decision-making throughout documented period." Disappearance circumstances remain unexplained, but do not align with standard patterns of misadventure or voluntary departure. Possibility of undisclosed factors affecting investigation cannot be ruled out. File should remain open. The coordinates Hazel provided are marked in provincial wilderness databases, with a notation indicating historical significance. Anyone requesting travel permits for that area receives advisory information about the case, though no restrictions are placed on access. The cabin site, if it can still be located, contains no hazards beyond those common to any abandoned structure in the wilderness, but the note Hazel left carries a warning that has never been explained: do not follow after dark. What that warning meant, and what Hazel encountered during her final approach to the second site, remains unknown. The journal offers no answers. The searchers found no evidence. And the forest keeps its secrets with a patience that outlasts human memory and official inquiry. Hazel Rennick walked into the winter wilderness in November of 1980. She survived an entire year in isolation, documented observations that troubled investigators, and then vanished while attempting to reach something she called the watching structure. Whether she found what she was looking for, whether it cost her life, or whether she simply walked deeper into the wilderness and chose never to return, are questions that have no verified answers. The file remains open. The coordinates remain on record. And somewhere in the unbroken forest of northwestern Ontario, between the named lakes and the forgotten logging camps, there might still be a structure that watches and waits, unknown to official records and visible only to those who venture far enough into the wilderness to leave behind all markers of the mapped world. This is the case of Hazel Rennick. This is the file that was never satisfactorily closed.